What would you do if the man you crossed a continent to marry took one look at your face and left you to freeze in the unforgiving Montana winter? Abigail Thornton had exactly $2 to her name when she was publicly discarded by Oak Haven's wealthiest cattle baron. But fate has a wicked, unpredictable sense of humor. Desperate, starving, and shivering in a rundown line shack on the edge of town, she opened her door to a bloodied, dying mountain man the whole territory despised. She spent her absolute last pennies to save him, never suspecting that the broke outcast she nursed back to life secretly held the deed to the very town that rejected her. Welcome to a tale of betrayal, survival, and $1 million secret. Abigail Thornton stepped off the Union Pacific locomotive into the biting wind of Oak Haven, Montana. Her worn leather satchel gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. The year was 1887, and the boomtown was a chaotic symphony of hammering wood, shouting drovers, and the heavy thud of boots on boardwalks. It smelled of pine sap, coal smoke, and raw frontier ambition. For Abigail, it was supposed to smell like salvation. In the pocket of her faded wool coat rested a marriage contract, signed by Josiah Cartwright, a man whose letters had painted him as a lonely rancher seeking a devoted wife to share his sprawling estate. Abigail had spent her last dime escaping a grueling life at a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, where 14-hour days had cost her dearly. A snapped loom belt 2 years prior had left a jagged, pale scar running along her left jawline. It wasn't grotesque, but in the rigid, judgmental society of the East, it had branded her unmarriageable. Josiah's letters, however, had promised a fresh start, claiming he cared nothing for superficial beauty, only for a woman with a strong spirit and a kind heart. She stood on the wooden platform, the cold seeping through the thin soles of her boots, watching the crowd thin out. Finally, a polished black buggy, pulled by 2 magnificent roans, rolled up to the station. A man stepped down. He was undeniably handsome, dressed in a tailored broadcloth suit, a silk vest, and a pristine Stetson. He possessed the arrogant, careless stride of a man who owned everything his eyes touched. "Miss Thornton?" he asked, his voice smooth but lacking the warmth she had imagined from his letters. "Mr. Cartwright," Abigail replied, offering a tentative, hopeful smile. She stepped forward, the crisp wind blowing her hood back, exposing her face to the harsh midday sun. Josiah's blue eyes locked onto her face. The polite smile on his lips instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly frown of visible revulsion. He stepped back, his gaze fixated on the pale scar tracing her jaw. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice carrying over the noise of the depot. Several bystanders, including Hiram Booker, the town mayor, and Mrs. Gable, the local mercantile owner, turned to watch the spectacle. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. Her hand instinctively flew to her cheek. I wrote to you about the accident at the mill, Josiah," I explained. "You said you had a minor blemish," Josiah interrupted, his tone turning cruel and loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "You did not say you were a mangled factory girl. I sent for a wife to sit at the head of my table, to host governors and cattle buyers. I ordered a bride, Miss Thornton, not damaged goods." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Abigail felt a hot, prickling wave of humiliation wash over her. "The contract," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her desperate attempt to maintain her dignity. "I traveled 2,000 miles. I have nothing left." Josiah reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his copy of the marriage contract, and tore it cleanly in half, letting the pieces flutter to the muddy ground. "Consider the engagement void. You breached the terms of our agreement through deception. I strongly suggest you find a return ticket back to whatever slum you crawled out of." Without another word, Josiah turned on his heel, climbed back into his luxurious buggy, and snapped the reins, leaving Abigail standing in the freezing mud amidst the hushed, staring crowd. She turned to the onlookers, silently pleading for a shred of empathy, but Oak Haven belonged to Josiah Cartwright. Mayor Booker tipped his hat awkwardly and hurried away. "Mrs." Gable gave her a look of pity mixed with disdain and retreated into her store. Even Sheriff Amos Brody, leaning against a post, simply averted his eyes. No one crossed Josiah. For the next 2 days, Abigail wandered the boardwalks of Oakhaven, seeking any kind of employment. She offered to wash dishes, mend clothes, or scrub floors. But Josiah had made his displeasure known, and the townspeople, terrified of losing the rancher's lucrative business, practically shut their doors in her face. By the afternoon of the third day, the sky turned the color of bruised iron. A vicious winter storm was rolling off the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. Abigail had $2.40 to her name. She had not eaten in over 24 hours. Driven out of town by the impending freeze and the cruel indifference of the locals, she followed a set of wagon ruts up a steep, wooded incline just outside the town limits. There, hidden among a dense grove of towering ponderosa pines, sat an abandoned line shack. The roof sagged, the windows were boarded up, and the door hung precariously on one rusted leather hinge. It was a miserable, rotting shell, but it was shelter. Abigail dragged herself inside, the wind howling at her back. She spent her remaining strength stuffing dry pine needles and old rags into the cracks between the logs to block the freezing drafts. She managed to start a small fire in the crumbling stone hearth using a handful of dry twigs and a single precious match. Huddled in the corner, wrapped in her thin coat, Abigail finally allowed the tears to fall. She was entirely alone, trapped in a hostile wilderness, cast aside like trash. As the wind screamed outside, burying the shack in snow, Abigail closed her eyes and prepared for the very real possibility that she would not survive the week. The blizzard raged for 3 days, transforming Oakhaven and the surrounding mountains into a desolate, white wasteland. Inside the drafty shack, Abigail survived on melted snow and a single loaf of stale bread she had bought with her meager funds before leaving town. She kept the small fire alive, feeding it piece by piece with broken furniture left behind by the shack's previous occupants. On the night of the third day, the wind was a deafening roar. Abigail was huddled near the weak flames, her body trembling violently when she heard it. Thud. It was a heavy, sickening sound against the front door, barely audible over the gale. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Wolves? Bears? This territory was teeming with predators. Thud. Scratch. Then came a low, gravelly groan that was unmistakably human. Abigail hesitated. She had nothing to defend herself with save for a rusted iron poker. But the agonizing groan came again, weaker this time. Gritting her teeth, she gripped the iron poker, unlatched the heavy wooden bar she had fashioned across the door, and pulled it open. A massive figure immediately collapsed inward, falling face first onto the dirt floor in a heap of snow, animal pelts, and blood. Abigail gasped, dropping the poker. She struggled to roll the enormous man onto his back. He was a giant, standing easily over 6 feet 4 inches, broad-shouldered and heavily muscled. His face was buried under a thick, wild beard encrusted with ice. He wore patched buckskins and a heavy bear-hide coat that was soaked through not just with snow, but with dark, crimson blood. It was Gideon Lockwood. Even a stranger to Oakhaven like Abigail had heard the whispers about him in her few days in town. The locals called him the Broke Bear of Blackridge. According to the town gossips, Gideon was a madman who had inherited a small fortune from his eastern mining family, only to squander every penny of it on useless, barren land high up in the mountains. Destitute and insane, he had retreated into the wilderness, living like a wild animal. The townspeople mocked him, and Josiah Cartwright frequently used him as the punchline for his cruel jokes at the saloon. But looking at him now, Abigail saw no punchline. She saw a dying man. Gideon's chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. Peeling back his heavy, frozen coat, Abigail recoiled. A bullet had torn through his upper left shoulder, leaving a ragged, gaping exit wound near his collarbone. This was no hunting accident. The angle of the shot meant someone had ambushed him from above. He had clearly been crawling through the blizzard for miles, losing dangerous amounts of blood. "Help me," she whispered to the empty room, her panic rising. She had no medical supplies, no food, and almost no wood. But if she did nothing, the town's mocked outcast would die on her floor. Driven by a desperate maternal instinct to preserve life, Abigail sprang into action. She dragged him closer to the hearth, a monumental task that left her muscles screaming. She took her last clean petticoat, a garment meant for her wedding night, and tore it into long, white strips. She packed snow into a rusted tin pot and thrust it into the fire to boil. With shaking hands, she cleaned the gruesome wound. Gideon was burning with a raging fever, thrashing in his delirium. His massive hands, calloused and scarred, suddenly shot out and gripped her wrist with terrifying strength. "The ledger," he rasped, his eyes rolling back in his head. "They found the vein. Don't let Cartwright. Don't let him." "Hush now," Abigail soothed, her voice trembling but firm. She pried his fingers from her bruised wrist. "You're safe. You're out of the storm." For 2 grueling days and nights, Abigail did not sleep. The mountain man hovered on the razor's edge of death. Infection set into his shoulder, radiating a sickening heat. When her boiled snow wasn't enough to clean the wound, she made a reckless decision. She bundled herself up, braved the tail end of the blizzard, and trekked the 2 miles down into Oakhaven. She marched straight into Dr. Horace Pendleton's office, her face red from the cold. She slapped her remaining $2.40 on his desk, her absolute last lifeline in this world. "I need carbolic acid, clean bandages, and sulfur," she demanded, her voice hoarse. Dr. Pendleton sneered at the meager coins. "And who is this for, Miss Thornton? Yourself?" "For Gideon Lockwood. He's been shot." The doctor let out a barking laugh. "The broke bear? Save your pennies, girl. If the bullet doesn't kill him, the starvation will. I'm not wasting my good medicine on a crazy mountain tramp, and I certainly won't hike up to that rotting shack to treat him." "Then sell me the supplies, and I will do it myself," Abigail snapped, her eyes flashing with a fierce defiance that momentarily stunned the arrogant doctor. Reluctantly, he shoved a small bottle of acid and a roll of gauze across the desk, sweeping her coins into his drawer. Abigail walked back up the mountain, completely penniless, her stomach hollow with hunger, but her hands full of salvation. She poured the stinging acid into Gideon's wound, ignoring his agonizing roars that shook the dust from the rafters. She packed it with sulfur and bound it tight. She melted her stale bread into a warm gruel, carefully spooning it past his cracked lips, singing soft hymns to drown out the howling wind and his feverish mutterings. On the morning of the 6th day, the storm finally broke, revealing a brilliant, blindingly clear winter sun. Abigail was asleep, slumped against the stone hearth, an empty tin cup loosely held in her blistered hands. A low, deep voice broke the silence. "You gave away your last coat to blanket me." Abigail's eyes snapped open. She scrambled backward, her heart hammering. Gideon Lockwood was awake. He was propped up against the log wall, his piercing, intelligent gray eyes fixed entirely on her. He didn't look crazy. He didn't look wild. Despite the unkempt beard and the pale exhaustion in his face, his gaze was sharp, calculating, and completely lucid. He looked down at his bandaged shoulder, smelling the sulfur and carbolic acid, then looked around the sparse, freezing room. His eyes finally rested on her face, lingering not with disgust on her scar, but with profound, quiet awe at the dark circles under her eyes and the frost-bitten tips of her fingers. "I know who you are," Gideon said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small room. "You're the bride Cartwright threw away like garbage in front of the whole town." Abigail looked away, shame burning her cheeks. "Yes." Gideon shifted his massive frame, wincing slightly as his muscles pulled against the stitches. He reached into the inner lining of his blood-stained coat and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. He tapped it slowly with a thick finger. "Josiah Cartwright didn't discard you because you're broken, Abigail," Gideon said quietly. "He discarded you because he is a vain, foolish man who only sees the surface of things. It's a flaw that is going to cost him everything he owns." Gideon met her eyes, a dangerous, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The town thinks I'm a broke madman who bought a mountain of worthless rock. They think I'm poor." He leaned forward, the intensity in his gray eyes pinning her in place. "But they don't know what I found deep inside that rock. And thanks to you keeping me alive, they are about to find out. Abigail stared at the heavy leather ledger resting in Gideon Lockwood's massive palm. The pages, stained with sweat and dirt, were filled with meticulously recorded dates, geological coordinates, and numbers that made no sense to her. She hesitated, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between the dying, outcast mountain man she had dragged out of the snow and the sharp, calculating intellect now radiating from his gray eyes. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper in the quiet shack. "Proof," Gideon replied, his voice gravelly but steady. He flipped the ledger open with his good hand, pointing to a column of assay values. "When I came out west, the locals in Oak Haven took one look at my eastern clothes and decided I was a fool with a heavy purse. Josiah Cartwright, the great cattle baron, sold me the Black Ridge tract. It's 4,000 acres of sheer granite, jagged ravines, and dead pine. Cartwright charged me triple its worth, boasting to the whole town how he'd swindled the greenhorn." Gideon let out a rough, bitter chuckle that ended in a sharp wince as his wounded shoulder protested. "But my grandfather wasn't a rancher, Abigail. He was a Welsh coal miner. I grew up learning how to read the earth." Cartwright looked at Black Ridge and saw useless rock that couldn't feed a single cow. I looked at the quartz veins bleeding through the granite and saw the mother lode. Abigail moved closer, the cold forgotten. "You found gold?" "Silver," Gideon corrected, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, quiet intensity. "A vein so pure and so vast it makes the Comstock lode look like a child's piggy bank. I've spent the last 3 years digging it out by hand, charting the tunnels, and keeping myself looking like a starving madman so no one would ask questions. I played the fool. I let them laugh. But they stopped laughing," Abigail deduced, her gaze dropping to the bloody bandages wrapping his massive chest. Gideon nodded slowly. About a month ago, Cartwright tried to buy the land back. He realized the railroad was planning a new spur line right through the base of the mountain. I refused to sell. That made him suspicious. A man who owns half the territory doesn't take kindly to being told no by the town beggar. He sent a surveyor, Elias Finch, to snoop around my property. I caught Finch near the upper shaft, but not before he snatched a raw chunk of silver ore the size of a melon. Abigail's breath hitched. He took it to Josiah. And Josiah realized he had practically given away a multi-million-dollar empire, Gideon said, his jaw tightening. 3 days ago, I was packing my saddlebags to ride to the territorial capital in Helena. I needed to file the federal mining patent and secure the deed permanently. Cartwright couldn't let me make that ride. He sent his chief enforcer, Beaumont Miller, to intercept me. "They shot you from above," she whispered, recalling the gruesome angle of the bullet wound. "Ambushed me in the gorge," Gideon confirmed. "I managed to throw myself into the river, let the current drag me under the ice, and crawled the rest of the way here. Cartwright assumes I'm dead in the snow. If I don't file that patent within the week, he will use his political influence with Judge Cornelius Alston to declare the land abandoned, seize the deed, and take the mine." Abigail sat back on her heels, the magnitude of the situation settling over her like a heavy wool blanket. The man sitting before her was not a broke mountain tramp. He was, quite possibly, the richest man in Montana. And Josiah Cartwright, the man who had humiliated her, stripped her of her dignity, and left her to die, was about to steal it all. Gideon reached out, his calloused, weather-beaten fingers gently brushing the edge of the scar on Abigail's jawline. She flinched instinctively, conditioned by years of revulsion from others, but his touch was surprisingly tender. "He called you damaged," Gideon murmured, his gray eyes softening with profound respect. But a man who has spent his life breaking rock knows that the deepest veins of treasure are only found where the earth has been fractured. "You have a warrior's mark, Abigail Thornton. You fought to survive the mills, and you fought the storm to keep me alive. You are the strongest woman I have ever met." A hot tear spilled over Abigail's eyelashes, tracking down the scarred skin. For the first time in her life, a man looked at her and saw something infinitely valuable. "I have no money, Gideon," she said fiercely, wiping the tear away. "I have no family. I have nothing but the clothes on my back. But Josiah Cartwright tried to bury us both in this winter. Tell me what we need to do." Gideon's predatory smile returned. We let them think I'm dead. And then we take back the mountain. Down in the valley, the town of Oak Haven was thawing out from the blizzard. Inside the opulent mahogany-paneled office of the Cartwright Ranch, Josiah Cartwright was pouring himself a glass of expensive Kentucky bourbon. The fire roared in the hearth, a stark contrast to the freezing misery he had condemned his mail-order bride to endure. The heavy oak door swung open, and Dr. Horace Pendleton stepped inside, brushing snow from his bowler hat. "Horace," Josiah greeted smoothly, offering a glass. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Did the freeze take many of the livestock?" "A few head of cattle, Josiah," the doctor replied, accepting the drink. "But I came to tell you something peculiar. That scarred girl, the one from Massachusetts. She didn't leave town." Josiah's expression soured. "I don't care about a factory rat's whereabouts. She'll freeze or starve soon enough." "Perhaps," Pendleton mused, swirling the amber liquid. "But 2 days ago, right in the teeth of the storm, she marched into my clinic, paid for carbolic acid, bandages, and sulfur with her absolute last pennies." Josiah paused, the glass halfway to his lips. "Medicine? For what?" "A gunshot wound," the doctor said. "She claimed she was treating Gideon Lockwood, the broke bear." The silence in the room became absolute. Josiah slowly lowered his glass, his knuckles turning white. He turned toward the window, looking up at the jagged, snow-capped peaks of Blackridge in the distance. Beaumont Miller had sworn on his life that he had put a Winchester rifle bullet through Gideon's chest. If Gideon was alive and the girl was nursing him, the federal mining patent was still in jeopardy. "Beaumont!" Josiah bellowed, his voice echoing through the grand house. Within seconds, a tall, gaunt man with cold, reptilian eyes appeared in the doorway. He wore twin revolvers low on his hips. "Take Deputy Boone and 3 of the ranch hands," Josiah ordered, his voice laced with venom. "Right up to the old line shack on the timberline. If the girl and the mountain man are there, burn it to the ground with them inside. Leave nothing but ash." High on the mountain, the midday sun was deceptive, offering light but no real warmth. Inside the shack, Gideon was pushing his body to the absolute limit. He had fashioned a sling for his left arm from Abigail's torn apron. He was pale, sweating profusely, but moving with the driven urgency of a hunted animal. "They will come," Gideon warned, stuffing the ledger into a waxed canvas sack, along with a heavy Colt revolver he had hidden beneath the floorboards. "Pendleton is a gossiping coward. If he tells Cartwright you bought medicine, Cartwright will put 2 and 2 together." "Can you ride?" Abigail asked, her voice tight with anxiety as she strapped on her worn boots. "We don't have horses," Gideon replied grimly. "We have to climb. We need to reach my main cabin inside the Blackridge claim. I have horses stabled in a natural cave system there, and enough supplies to make the trek to Helena." He handed Abigail a smaller, snub-nosed derringer. "Keep this in your pocket. Do not hesitate if a man comes through that door without an invitation." They stepped out into the blinding glare of the snow. The air was razor-sharp, burning Abigail's lungs. Gideon led the way, his massive frame breaking a trail through the waist-deep drifts. He moved agonizingly slowly, his breathing ragged, leaning heavily on a thick pine branch. Abigail followed closely, practically pushing him forward when his steps faltered. They had only made it a half-mile up the steep, wooded ridge when the sound of horses breaking through the snow echoed from below. Abigail threw herself behind a massive boulder, pulling Gideon down beside her. Peering through the frosted pine needles, she saw 5 men on horseback surrounding the dilapidated line shack. She recognized Beaumont Miller by his dark duster coat and Deputy Boone by the tin star pinned to his chest. "Check the inside," Beaumont barked, dismounting, with a rifle in hand. Boone kicked the door open, his gun drawn. A moment later he emerged, shaking his head. "Empty. But the ashes in the hearth are still warm. They can't be far." Beaumont sneered, pulling a kerosene lantern from his saddle. He smashed it against the wooden wall of the shack and tossed a match. Instantly, the dry, rotted wood went up in a brilliant roar of orange flames. "Spread out!" Beaumont shouted to the ranch hands. "Follow the tracks in the snow. Cartwright pays $50 a head." "Keep moving," Gideon whispered fiercely, grabbing Abigail's hand. The climb became a waking nightmare. Every step was a battle against the mountain and the pursuing men. The sound of shouting voices and snapping branches drifted up from the timberline, growing steadily closer. Gideon was losing strength rapidly. The makeshift bandage beneath his coat was blooming with fresh crimson. "I can't. I'm slowing you down," Gideon gasped, collapsing against the trunk of a spruce tree. "Take the ledger, Abigail. Follow the ridge north to the pass. You can make it to Helena alone." "I am not leaving you!" Abigail hissed, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that startled him. "I did not spend my wedding petticoat and my last 3 pennies to let you die against a tree. Get up!" Her sheer willpower seemed to ignite a final spark of adrenaline in the giant. Gritting his teeth, Gideon hauled himself upright. 200 yards, he rasped, through the vale. They pushed through a dense thicket of freezing brush and emerged at the base of a towering vertical cliff face of solid granite. At first glance, it was a dead end. But Gideon moved toward a frozen waterfall, a cascade of thick blue ice clinging to the rock. He slipped behind the icy curtain, dragging Abigail with him. The air instantly warmed. They were standing in the mouth of a massive, cavernous tunnel, carved directly into the heart of the mountain. Lanterns hung on iron hooks along the walls, illuminating wooden support beams and tracks laid out for mining carts. But it was the walls themselves that stole Abigail's breath. Striking a match, Gideon lit the nearest lantern. The flickering amber light danced across the cavern. The dark granite was split by massive, jagged veins of pure, glittering silver. It looked as though the mountain had bled starlight. The sheer volume of wealth surrounding them was unfathomable. It was an empire hidden in the dark. "Welcome to Black Ridge," Gideon said softly, leaning heavily against a wooden support beam. Abigail reached out, her gloved fingers tracing the cold, raw silver embedded in the rock. "It's beautiful." "It's nothing compared to what you did for me," Gideon replied, his voice echoing softly in the cavern. He stepped closer to her, the lantern light casting warm shadows across his rugged face. He took her cold, trembling hands in his one good hand, his thumb gently brushing over her knuckles. "When we get to Helena, Abigail, when this is over, and the patent is signed." Gideon paused, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability she hadn't expected from such a formidable man. "I am putting half of this mine in your name." Abigail gasped, trying to pull her hands back, but he held firm. "Gideon, no. You bled for this. You dug this with your bare hands. I am just a factory girl who happened to be there. You are the woman who saved my life when the whole world turned its back on me," Gideon countered, stepping into her space. The distance between them vanished, replaced by the crackling tension of unspoken promises. "Josiah Cartwright tore up a contract because he was too blind to see your worth. I don't need a contract to know yours. Half the mine is yours, and if you'll let me, I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that you belong at the head of a table." Abigail looked up into his gray eyes, the ghosts of her past rejections melting away in the heat of his gaze. She didn't turn away when he lowered his head. Their lips met in the quiet dark of the silver mine, a kiss born of desperate survival, fierce loyalty, and a shared understanding of what it meant to be broken and rebuilt. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sharp, echoing crack of a rifle shot from outside the cave entrance, followed by the sickening thud of lead striking wood just inches from Gideon's head. "They found the ice veil," Gideon roared, shoving Abigail behind an overturned mining cart and pulling his Colt revolver. "Stay down!" Gunfire erupted in the cavern, deafening cracks echoing off the granite. Splinters showered over Abigail as a Winchester slug tore through the mining cart she hid behind. Gideon didn't flinch. Despite blood seeping through his bandages, his hand was steady. He leveled his heavy Colt revolver and fired twice. The massive boom drowned out the rifles. A sharp cry echoed as Deputy Boone dropped his weapon, clutching his shattered knee. "Flank them!" Beaumont Miller barked from the shadows. "The boss wants them dead!" "Stay low," Gideon growled. He grabbed a lantern, smashed the glass, and hurled it at a stack of wooden crates. The kerosene ignited instantly, creating a roaring wall of fire that separated them from Beaumont's men. "We can't hold them!" Abigail yelled. We don't intend to. Gideon hauled himself up, grabbing the canvas sack containing the ledger. He seized Abigail's hand. Run! They sprinted deeper into the mountain, leaving the fire behind. The darkness was absolute. Save for a single match, Gideon struck. Behind them, furious shouts echoed as Beaumont's men tried to extinguish the flames. After a grueling uphill sprint, the tunnel opened into a large rotunda smelling of hay. By the fading match light, Abigail saw 3 massive draft horses in wooden stalls. Saddle the roan, Gideon ordered, slumping against the rock. The tunnel behind the stalls opens into the valley gorge, a 3-day ride from Helena. Abigail's hands moved with frantic precision, throwing a heavy saddle over the horse and buckling the cinch. She dragged Gideon toward the animal, helping him hoist his frame into the saddle before climbing up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, grabbing the reins. As they spurred the horse into the tunnel, a massive explosion shook the mountain. Gideon had rigged a tripwire to blasting powder. The tunnel behind them collapsed in a thunderous roar of granite, permanently sealing Beaumont Miller on the wrong side. The journey to Helena was a grueling test of endurance. For 3 days, they rode through freezing wilderness. Abigail hunted snow hares with the derringer and kept Gideon's fever at bay by packing his shoulder with fresh snow. By the time the brick-lined streets of the capital came into view, Gideon was barely conscious, and Abigail operated on sheer willpower. They didn't go to a hospital. Gideon directed her to the residence of Governor Samuel Hauser, a man whose political integrity was legendary, and who harbored a deep disdain for Oakhaven's arrogant barons. For 2 weeks, Abigail never left Gideon's bedside. Under the city's finest physicians, his fever finally broke. His strength returned, matched only by his burning determination to finish what Josiah Cartwright had started. On the 15th day, the trap sprang. Inside the marble-floored federal land office, Josiah Cartwright stood at the mahogany counter, dressed in his finest suit, flanked by high-priced lawyers. The mandatory filing period has expired, Josiah stated smoothly. Gideon Lockwood is legally deceased. As the owner of the adjacent properties, I am filing a claim of abandonment on the Black Ridge tract. Transfer the deed to my name. The nervous clerk adjusted his spectacles. Before he could stamp the document, the heavy oak doors swung open. I wouldn't ink that stamp just yet, a booming voice echoed. Josiah froze. The blood drained from his face as he turned. Standing in the doorway, wearing a tailored black suit, was Gideon Lockwood. His left arm was in a sling, but his gray eyes were alight with predatory triumph. Beside him stood Abigail, wearing a stunning emerald velvet dress that complemented her fierce dignity. The pale scar on her jaw caught the light, no longer a mark of shame, but a badge of victory. Flanking them were Governor Hauser and U.S. Marshal Harrison Clifford. Lockwood, Josiah breathed, panicked. You're dead. I survived, Josiah, Gideon said. And I survived the ambush. Beaumont Miller confessed to organizing. Men trapped in a collapsed mine for 3 days become surprisingly willing to testify for a rescue. Marshal Clifford stepped forward, pulling heavy iron handcuffs. Josiah Cartwright, you're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit claim jumping. This is an outrage, Josiah sputtered. I am the wealthiest man in Oakhaven. About your wealth, Gideon interrupted, pulling the worn ledger from his pocket. I understand you leveraged your entire ranch, taking massive loans to bribe the railroad executives. You assumed you were about to own a silver mine to pay off the debt. Josiah's arrogant facade completely shattered. The federal patent for the Black Ridge silver mine was secured this morning, Gideon continued. Without my silver, you cannot pay your loans. The bank is foreclosing on the Cartwright Ranch tomorrow. Josiah collapsed against the counter, utterly destroyed, as Marshal Clifford clamped the irons around his wrists. The great cattle baron had lost his empire to his own blinding greed. Gideon turned to Abigail, the hard edges of his face softening. He handed the newly stamped deed to the clerk. Name the claim, the clerk said. Gideon looked at Abigail, his hand resting on her waist. The Abigail mine. Put 50% of the shares in my wife's name. Abigail looked up, her heart soaring. She had arrived with $2 and a broken contract. Now, she was the co-owner of the richest silver vein in Montana, beside a man who loved her fiercely for the scars she bore. The blizzard had not broken her. it had forged her empire. What an incredible journey of resilience, survival, and ultimate poetic justice. Abigail's story proves that true worth isn't found in a flawless appearance, but in the unbreakable spirit of a woman who refuses to be discarded. Josiah Cartwright learned the hard way that arrogance and greed will always pave the road to ruin, while the Broke Bear of Blackridge showed us that the greatest treasures are often hidden beneath a rough exterior. If you were captivated by Abigail and Gideon's fight against the odds and their multi-million-dollar triumph, hit that like button right now. Who was your favorite character in this Wild West showdown? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts. Don't forget to share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life tales of romance, betrayal, and frontier justice. See you in the next video.